Hello, welcome to Advent Adventures. Today is Tuesday, December 7th. And we celebrate a saint that isn't too well known today, at least by many. His name is Ambrose. The gospel today talks about sheep again, like we've had before. And it's an interesting story because I talked with a shepherdess, this gal who, just an interesting character. She, among other things in her life, had spent several years as a shepherdess with a flock of well over 100, maybe 200 sheep that she took care of. And we had this wonderful conversation. She said, people don't get it, but they think that sheep are dumb, and they really aren't. They really aren't. But the problem with sheep is they're not very good at protecting themselves. That's why they need a shepherd or a shepherdess, because they need someone to watch over them, because they just don't know really how to protect themselves from the dangers around them. They wander into places that maybe are unsafe and end up falling or being hurt, need to be rescued, or they don't know how to protect themselves from the wolves and other predators out in the outback, the outside world. That's why they need a shepherd. Jesus is talking to shepherds in this crowd, people who are familiar with sheep, and he says, well, what's your opinion? What do you think? And there was a shepherd who had 100 sheep, and one wandered off, and which one of you wouldn't go off and look for that one, and when you find it, go back and say, rejoice with me, because I found my lost sheep, and would leave the 99 behind. And, my friend said, no shepherd would do that, because that would be crazy. You need to protect these others. And it's an interesting thing, because Jesus said he's the one that would go looking for the one. And he is crazy, in some ways. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but remember, we believe that he was God. And he gave up the life of God to become a human being, to share our life. He was born as a vulnerable infant and had to flee for his life before he could even walk. And lived a life of poverty and humble service. He was one that found himself, under attack by those who didn't like what he was saying. He didn't have an easy life by any stretch of the imagination. Never used his power for himself. And yet, he was always looking for the lost. He went out searching. He went out to protect the one who was most vulnerable. He reveals to us a God who's crazy in love with us, who's willing to go to such extremes as even becoming one of us in order to have us as his own, to embrace us in love. And that's the one we celebrate. It's a wonderful, wonderful God, the God we celebrate each day. Jesus says that's the way God is. And today the church commemorates a man named Ambrose who lived in the 4th century, who actually was pretty wise man. He had a great grasp of the story of Jesus and sought to live the gospel. In the early 4th century, he proclaimed the good news of the gospel and became a bishop in the city of Milan. And many people really came to faith because of the insight that Ambrose had. You may not know much about Ambrose, but I'll bet that all of you know the one who is his most significant convert, and that is St. Augustine, who was certainly lost for many years, wandered around, and finally only came to faith in Christ because of the preaching of Ambrose. This one who himself sought out the lost sheep, and when they found him, brought him into the mystery of God's love. Today we celebrate a God who's crazy in love with us, who's willing even to share our humanity. And I recall the words of another saint that lived about the same time. It was St. Irenaeus of Lyon, who lived about actually 100 years before Ambrose. He said, when asked the question, why would God become a human being? He said simply, so that human beings can become like God. That's the invitation, my sisters and brothers. That's the invitation of Advent and Christmas and Lent and Easter and ordinary time. The invitation that's extended to us every day to become more and more like God, who's crazy in love with us. Have a great Advent and a wonderful Christmas.